Lawrence Alloway came up with the phrase pop in 1958. However, the meaning behind it was mistaken. Pop referred to the rapid increase of people across the entire Western society. This society was trademarked with shared values, which were causing new forms of cultural expressionism to come into existence, as well as ideas pertaining to mass culture. Pop art was a visual art that was characterized by a sense of optimism during the post-war consumer boom of the 1950s and 1960s. The end of World War II brought thousands of young servicemen back to America to pick up their lives and start new families in homes with new jobs. With an energy never before experienced, American industry expanded to meet peacetime needs. Americans began buying goods not available during the war, which created corporate expansion and jobs. Growth everywhere. The art boom was underway. All the pop art paintings and works had a similar interest in common: mass media, mass production, and mass culture. Pop art came about the early 1950s by a group of artists who called themselves the Independent Group, or IG. The artists Richard Hamilton and Eduardo Pelosi were among the founding members of the Independent Group, a collective of artists, architects, and writers who explored radical approaches to contemporary visual culture. American pop art contrasted the style of British pop art. American pop artists tended to have more of an ambiguous attitude towards their subject matter. Consumerism played an introductory role in the movement. It suggests that happiness can be achieved through the purchase of goods and services. Appropriation also played a role in the movement. It used existing images and objects to create a new work of art. However, during the movement, it led to crucial viewpoints about whether or not a piece of art is truly original. The turning point into pop culture was the moment when TV began to outstrip cinema and the principal means of global visual communication. People adopted a distanced response to the world, an orientation towards youth and hedonism, and a witty irrelevance on anything ranging from religion to art. This attitude allowed them to comment on the vacuity of mass consumption as typified by its fetishes. For example, hamburgers, Coca-Cola bottles, and etc. It coincided with the globalization of pop music and youth culture personified by Elvis and the Beatles. Pop art was brash, young, and fun, and rebelled against the public opinion of what art should be. There were many emerging artists who struck out during the pop art movement. These artists shared a determination to create art that would reach down below the subconscious to touch core values of spirituality, emotion, experience, etc. Artists used techniques to seamlessly merge high art and pop culture. Many artists sought to make literal connections between the viewer and the subject. Many believed that everything was interconnected. Pop art, for the most part, completed the modernist movement in the 1970s with its optimistic investment in contemporary subject matters. It also ended the modernism movement. The most famous artists of this time are Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, Jasper Johns, and Robert Rauschenberg.
One of pop art's famous painters is Roy Lichtenstein. He was famous for his work in that they were inspired from panels in comic books. This drew both critics and admirers. Critics continue to say that his work didn't deserve the credit it received because he copied the idea and gave little or no credit to the graphic novel's publisher. This resembles the ready-mades that were used by Marcel Duchamp. However, Lichtenstein altered the image and the sayings in order to make them unique. Lichtenstein said, "I want it to look impersonal, but I don't think you can do a work of art and not really be involved in it." In order to more fully understand his distinctive portrayal of the object, we need to consider its brand name, trademark, and signatures in his work. His use of mechanical reproduction had been interpreted as a way of removing ownership. However, analysis of his work during this time shows something different. He was confronting critics and tensions between the ownership of commercial culture and fine art practice. His work brings together many concerns central to his work. His imagery consistently returns to visions and visuality, and because of this, it is hard to miss the intentional, intense mood it creates. Lichtenstein's work in this period would consistently return to the interaction between bodies and machines, particularly in context to historical developments in visual technology. The image duplicator is not depicted in his work and is only referenced, so so we are left unsure of magnitude of the device and its relation to the figure in the painting itself. His paintings use thick outlines, bolded colors, and Ben-Day dots. In order to get a bolder color, Lichtenstein used oils and acrylics. The Ben-Day dot printing process is a technique. Depending on the effect, color, and optical illusion needed, small colored dots are closely spaced, widely spaced, or overlapping. Pulp comic books of the 1950s and 1960s used Ben-Day dots in the four process colors to inexpensively create shading and secondary colors, such as green, purple, orange, and flesh tones. Ben-Day dots are always of equal size and distribution in a specific area. To apply the dots to a drawing, the artist would press a transparent overlay sheet, which gave the artist a range of tones to use in the work. The use of Ben-Day dots was a hallmark of American artist Roy Lichtenstein, who enlarged and exaggerated them in many of his paintings and sculptures. Lichtenstein also used machines within his paintings. He magnified the handmade sketch using a machine and finally traced the projected image. Look Mickey is often said to be Lichtenstein's first pop painting. It has been proven resistant to interpretation. Its humorous and childish subject matter made it seem unworthy of attention and analysis. However, it was Lichtenstein's first starting point for what may seem many and famous pieces of art. Look Mickey was made with oils and shows his patented red, blue, and yellow colors over a white canvas. Various pencil lines can be seen where he traced the motif onto the canvas. However, you notice the absence of Ben-Day dots, which creates a more childlike picture. From that, we can also tell that the Ben-Day dots were an addition to his paintings later on in his career. The absence of these dots also clashes with his pattern of using comic book-like motifs. Another one of Lichtenstein's trademark aspects is that it's missing the use of thick black lines to further define and intensify his work. However, his use of primary colors creates a bolder picture altogether. We also see how he continuously used machines within his paintings. Even here, he shows how a very simple machine, the fishing rod. We can also see in the bottom left corner of the picture there's his signature that is absent in much of his later work. He depicts two of the most famous and widely recognizable cartoon characters of all time. Mickey may represent the most exaggerated case of cartoon who stands for corporate identity. In this painting, Mickey is depicted by nothing more than a trademark. His famous comic strip images were stemmed from this. Within the pop art community, Roy Lichtenstein and Andy Warhol were said to be linked, due to their similar use of primary colors and focus on certain commercial objects.
Andy Warhol was born on August 6, 1928 in Pittsburgh. Warhol was always drawn to art. As a child, he took free art classes, frequently went to the movie theater to watch Hollywood movies, and took and developed his own pictures in his basement. During these days, most of the acclaimed artists were abstract expressionists. Warhol wanted to be different. Originally, he wanted to be a commercial artist, and he became very successful in this field during the 1950s. However, he left that and began creating pop art. He decided to paint common objects seen on a daily basis, such as movie stars, comics, and ads. Andy's work blurred the line between commercial art and fine art. Because of this, he was not held in high regards at first, but his art grew in demand. During the 1960s, Warhol focused on painting and many things aside from that. He created hundreds of movies and worked on performance art. He also self-published many books about himself and his art. Andy Warhol's Index from 1967 was the first one mass-produced. In 1969, he co-founded Interview, a magazine about film, fashion, and popular culture. Interview is still around today. Warhol also starred on TV shows and even hosted a couple of his own on New York TV and MTV. Along with that, he produced music videos for rock bands and went into modeling, where he appeared in fashion shows and in TV and print ads. Marilyn Monroe is one of the many famous icons Warhol used in his artwork. In 1962, Andy Warhol created Marilyn Diptych. Warhol's fascination with her made the diptych format appropriate to use because diptych format was originally used for religious images of personal devotion in medieval art. Symbolically, he was treating Marilyn like a saint, and this revealed his obsession with fame. Marilyn Diptych was created from two panels. The one on the left was repeated colorful pictures. These showed how mass exposure diminished herself, especially since the pictures displayed were her as a star and not a real person. The right panel was fading black and white pictures. This represented the short-lasting effects of fame. With each new day or new portrait, her importance faded. The whole transition from color to black and white to barely appearing seems to represent her life and death. Film is composed of rows of sequential pictures, and this series of pictures could allude to how Marilyn Monroe lived through film. Warhol did not believe skill and craftsmanship were successful ways of expressing the artist's personality. Warhol created his art in what he called the factory. There he used mechanical processes and silkscreens to develop his art in a mass-production way. The reason I'm painting this way is I want to be a machine. A machine creates the same thing time after time, and that's what Warhol wanted. Warhol said, "I think every painting should be the same size and same color, so they're all interchangeable, and nobody thinks they have a better or worse painting." Warhol wanted the content of his pictures to be unoriginal too. This could be caused through mass exposure. He did not want meaning and emotion to be present in the pictures he chose to use in his art because he did not want them to interfere with the art itself. Warhol's art was ambiguous, so viewers had to contemplate the meaning of his work. He said, "I started as a commercial artist, and I want to finish as a business artist. Being good in business is the most fascinating kind of art." Warhol wanted to turn to mass production because that was the direction everyone else was going and what was valued at the time. Warhol claimed the Campbell soup can was his favorite work and that I should have just done the Campbell soups and kept on doing them because everyone only does one painting anyway. Certainly it is the signature image of Warhol's career and a key transitional work from his hand-painted to photo-transferred paintings. Warhol had been working on his paintings inspired by ads and comic strips when he saw Roy Lichtenstein's comic strip paintings. A friend suggested that Warhol choose something that everyone recognized like Campbell soup. In a flash of inspiration, he bought cans from the store and began to trace projections onto canvases, as Lichtenstein did, painting within the outlines to resemble the appearance of the original offset lithogram labels. Instead of the dripping paint in his previous ads and comics, here Warhol used precision with the help of mechanical reproduction. Expanding his subject, he decided to paint one of each of the 32 variants of Campbell soup. Within the painting there is an obvious lack of pop art's patent bright colors. However, the mass production of the cans ties into the idea of popular culture and mass consumption. The use of the projector removes the artist's emotional and personal input. Warhol wanted the content to be detached in order to emphasize the population's infatuation with mass consumption and importance of machines within daily life.
Another popular artist of the pop art movement was Robert Rauschenberg. His combines represented the combination between the paintings and sculptures with a sense of drama to create a holistic view. Rauschenberg said that his combines were a way for him to make a connection. He said, "Paintings relate to both art and life lived. Neither can be made. I try to act in that gap between the two, and in fact, they seem to suggest the presence of an artist." Beginning of 1955, he began to incorporate his personal mementos and objects of importance to him in his combines. The combines, pertaining to the characteristics of intimacy and vitality, are a result of the relationship to the life of the artist. The combines are subdivided into combine paintings, which hang or orient themselves primarily against the wall, and combines, which contain wall and floor components or stand fully on the floor. The first combine works were combine paintings such as the Collection and Charlene of 1954. The present essay argues for an understanding of Collection not only as the key transitional work leading to the combines, but also as a marker of the point at which Rauschenberg began breaking down the boundaries between art, life, and society. Engagement with everyday materials and events that would come to define his works, and indeed much of the post-war art. Rauschenberg broke his combines into three: the red paintings, the black paintings, and the white paintings. The aspects of the combine began to emerge in the red paintings between 1953 and 1954. The earliest known photograph in Rauschenberg's combine is Collection. The multicolored stripes across the bottom are present, while the upper two-thirds is cluttered with newspaper, scraps of fabric, and thin washes and patches of paint. The small mirror is there, embedded just off the center and covered with a sheer fabric, and the scraps of wood and metal are affixated to the top edge appear just as they do today. In this state, the formula of layered paint, printed matter, and fabrics resembled that of many of the red paintings and black paintings. Paint unifies disparate elements with color and conveys a sense of motion or activity through gestural brushwork. However, much of the newsprinting collection is left uncharacteristically bare in comparison to a typical red painting, and the inclusion of three-dimensional found elements, which is also atypical. Although the pop art movement was happening, Robert didn't let go the style of paintings that were present during abstract expressionism movement. Depicting abstract expressionism allowed for Rauschenberg to import both enormous energy to make images and necessarily make analogous points about the dynamism of the contemporary world. As the red paintings were transitioning into the combines in 1954, he moved between 2D paintings to freestanding sculptures. Rauschenberg was keenly interested in the iconography of American popular culture. He developed a collage using atypical materials like house paint and using these atypical objects to make certain points. Robert soon switched over from abstract expressionism to pop art. One of his first and most famous combines was entitled The Monogram of 1959. Rauschenberg worked on the monogram for 4 years, trying to find the right placement of the goat. Eventually, he arrives at the arrangement of making the painting into an environment for the goat, which means the space of the painting is forced to accommodate the goat as a three-dimensional reality. Rauschenberg said that his goal was to make a picture out of the real world, rather than to make a picture look like the real world. To capture reality as a collage of details, which maintains the identity of the original objects and materials. The monogram would appear to be a major step in that direction. The idea of combining and of noticing combinations of objects and images remained the core of his work. In this way, he made comments about contemporary society. The works of Rauschenberg was often referred to as Neo-Dada, meaning an emphasis on the importance of the work of art produced rather than on the concept of generating the word, as it drew upon elements explored by Dadaists like Duchamp. Robert's paintings capture the visual noise in a framework of images whose narratives suggest some kind of ironic allegory. Rauschenberg's belief in chance operated as his guiding light for creativity. He would frequently incorporate objects he found on accident in Manhattan into his works, and he would place the things he found sequentially on his canvas. His works accurately represented our lives and how we are invariably ruled by chance. His works were based off of his intentions to portray reality at his best. For this reason, he used a photo silkscreen printing technique. He wished to change our perception and interpretation, like most artists try to do. His methods consisted of combining oil paintings with photographic silkscreens. Photo silkscreens were more accurate because it permitted the transfer of photographic images onto a screen of sensitized silk stretched out on a frame. The mesh of silk allows for ink or paint to pass through it onto a canvas or other support only where it is not prevented from doing so by a membrane of resistant gum. Rauschenberg's early paintings shared more with the elemental shapes and minimum palettes of black and white that distinguish abstract expressionism paintings. His later works purposefully used the reality in his photographs, the dynamic of energy, and the emphatic brushwork, with a loose juxtaposition of images to create subtle meanings embodying our perceptual experience. Rauschenberg said himself, "The photo can insist on reviewing moments that were unseen or not known they were seen, but passed in viewing. It's the experience of taking the photo that keeps my mind open to unprogrammed images, uncontrolled, and then permits me to handle them rawly or allow for them to be digested in a capacity of other species." The bed is another one of Rauschenberg's popular works. The image of the bed itself has associations with domesticity, with women, with the site of birth. This bed has associations with violence as well. Any bed, of course, has the potential to evoke multiple messages, just as this one does. Since so many of those meanings have to do with the passage or transformations of some sort, it is tempting to see his bed or his painting as a marking of the site of his own transformation, a new passage from one stage of his life in art to making another, and one stage of his awareness and acknowledgement of his sexuality identity to another. Jasper Johns, along with Roy Lichtenstein and Andy Warhol, and also Robert Rauschenberg, was a famous artist of the pop art movement.
Abstract expressionism was so lively. Personal identity and painting were more or less the same, and I tried to operate the same way. But I found I couldn't do anything that would be identical to my feelings. So I worked in such a way that I could say that it's not me, Jasper Johns said. This explains why he used techniques from abstract expressionism, but the effect was different. Johns believed works of art were not illusions, but rather represented an object with its own reality. This idea contributed to his controlled and less spontaneous style of painting. Johns usually painted with individual strokes and used controlled drips and splatters in his work. Johns also used very simplistic color palettes, which include the basic colors of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, and shades of gray. His reductive style of art made him an important catalyst to the beginning of conceptual and minimal art. However, he was most important to the pop art movement. Pierre Mondrian, a famous Dutch painter, came to New York during World War II. He painted simple reductive art, which was displayed in New York and helped develop the creative climate that Johns came into. Mondrian's reductive art happened to be the first pieces Johns saw when he came to New York in 1948, and it consequently influenced Johns' own art. Johns chose simple, familiar objects as the center of his art. Most of these objects were true dimensions and continued to appear in his art for decades. A good example of one of these objects is the American flag. Johns used ordinary and easily recognizable objects, like the flag, as the center of his art because he could then focus on exploring mediums and the process, which he believed to be the true art. For example, flag, which Jasper Johns painted during 1954 and 55, was done in encaustic, an archaic medium which began being used in the 1st century. Encaustic fuses pigments in hot wax and is also fast drying, so he could apply individual strokes. This causes the surface to be rough and the flag encrusted, which made the flag familiar and unusual at the same time. Again in 1955, Jasper Johns used the American flag as the center of a painting, this one entitled White Flag. Achromatic, monochromatic, or near monochromatic works, like this one, are common for Johns. In fact, the color gray was very important to many of Johns' paintings. He used it purposefully. Because of the infinite shades and hues of gray, it could be used to show the forms of objects without covering them in costumes of color. These objects painted in gray were free of predisposed ideas based on color, so paintings like this one were more open to interpretation. White Flag is made up of 3 different panels. Cut and torn newspaper and fabric were stuck to stars and stripes with beeswax. This allowed these areas to be built up so that the painting would invade the space of the viewer, like many post-World War II works. The flag theme continued to be present in following works. 3 Flags was composed by placing 3 canvases painted as flags on top of each other. One thing works one way, another thing works another way. One thing works different ways at different times. This quote, found in Jasper Johns' sketchbook, explains one of his main ideas of art. Johns tried to regulate sameness and change in his art, allowing the viewer to make their own decisions on the meaning of different pieces of similar art. It was also the viewer's responsibility to decide if the piece was even art in the first place. As we can see from the previous flag paintings and Flag on Orange Field, Johns doesn't break away from what he knows to do something completely new. Instead, he adds to paintings. Something new is added or changed in each of the flag paintings, but the fundamental ideas are still the same. There are several ideas for why the flag appears often in Johns' art. The first idea is, since Jasper Johns was named after a military hero who raised a flag during the Revolutionary War. It could be an autobiographical reference. Also, the flag art could be meant to address American art. Senator Joseph McCarthy, who tried to expose communists during the Red Scare, or the Vietnam War, depending on the time created and viewed. John's art has no concrete meaning and is continuously open to reinterpretation. Around 1960, Jasper Johns began making assemblages. These assemblages were made by integrating casts of body parts and other objects into his works of art. An example of one of these assemblages is Target with Four Faces, created by Johns in 1958. This is one of a series of target paintings done from 1958 to 1961. These targets can be representational of many things. Targets represent seeing across space, which has the potential to create depth in the paintings. They also imply violence because one usually shoots at a target. Visually, the concentric bands seem to allude to confusion rather than focus. The paths of these circles are continuous, signifying being trapped and unable to escape an endless cycle. The opposing colors also create an illusion of depth because it seems that there are circles stacked on each other instead of rings. A drawing compass is used to make circles. The continuous rotating motion of the compass is mechanical and seems like it could be representing mass production, a common theme of pop art. The cast of faces at the top of Target with Four Faces also seem to be essential to meaning in this piece of art. The casts are all the same woman who wears a serious expression. The casts were made so that each successive one, the woman's face became more relaxed and her mouth more open. However, the casts were not arranged in the order made. This mix-up was done so that it did not appear that she was about to speak. This could be representing that at this time, women did not have as many rights and that they could not speak as freely as men. Furthering this idea, the target is definitely the central visual focus of the painting, placing the woman in the background. She and other women could possibly be the target of oppression. As for Johns explained, the flags and targets have color positioned in a predetermined way. I wanted to find a way to apply color so that the color would be determined by some other method. With false start, Johns got to use color in an abstract way instead of his usual use of images in an abstract way. This painting strayed from Johns' norms in other ways too. One example is the name does not describe an obvious aspect of the work. Another way is that there is no recognizable figure, which makes the painting more risky. Aside from that, the work is done in oil, a change from Johns' usual use of encaustic. Because of the use of oil paint, the paint is more freely handled and the brushstrokes are different from his previous works. They are thick yet determined and controlled, which distances his painting from improvisational expressionism. Leaving encaustic left Johns with concerns at the painting being too flat. To help this, words and colors are layered to create depth. Johns uses the cubism technique of stenciling on the canvas to write names of colors on the painting. The color names usually do not represent the color they are written in or the color they are labeling. For example, the word orange is written in white and is placed on top of red. This mix creates a contradiction between linguistic and perceptual cues. This could perhaps explain the title. When people read off the word red written in yellow, they may start off reading yellow, but catch themselves. This would be a false start. Aside from paintings, Jasper Johns also focused on making sculptures. Unlike Duchamp, who took actual everyday objects and called them art, Johns created sculptures that look like real objects. Johns created his own work because the process of making the piece of art was one of the most important things to him. Lightbulb was sculpted in 1958. After that, Johns created a series of other light bulb sculptures based on this one. These were made from bronze and plaster.
Pop art targeted everyone, not just the rich people in the upper classes of society that had the money to afford expensive art. Art critics were basically critiquing old pieces that were known for the abstract nature that had already been critiqued, analyzed, and written about. The public was hesitant at first. When the pop art movement started, however, after some time, the constant depiction of items and people who were seen in the media and everyday life drew in crowds and admirers. According to Robert Hughes in Time magazine on April 15, 1974, pop art reflects the times. It is an expression of society that puts less emphasis on formal education and even wealth. It is a chic concept which is open to everyone. In other words, pop art was an eye-catching and was targeted to the average man. It required little to no interpretation and drew people in with its bright and popular concepts.